We ready to go? Okay, so welcome to risk security and risk management in the smart grid. I'm Bob Lockhart. I'm the panel moderator for this. We are going to, as I mentioned, we're going to be streaming this broadcast through the internet through Erfan's educational service. So welcome to all the people out there in Radio Land that are listening to us. And we're here in Washington, D.C. at the Washington Convention Center. So up here on the panel with me, I've got Darren Highfill, who's founder and managing partner of Utilizec. Matthew Light of the ESC2M2 project, who's working on reliability, infrastructure security, and restoration there. Tim Roxey with NERC, Glen Haddix with Southern California Edison, and Erfan Ibrahim with the Bazaar. So what I thought I would do is let each of our panelists begin with a better introduction of themselves than I've just done. And then after that, I'll give you each about 5 minutes to talk about what you see as major issues going on with smart grid cybersecurity and risk management. There's no structure to this. There are going to be no slides. The emphasis is discussion. You can interrupt us anytime you want. Stick your hand up. We'll let you ask a question. I haven't given them any agenda. I think some of them may get into fights with each other up here. I hope so. And we'll see where it goes. The objective is to just talk about what's really going on. And what I've asked them to do is to be as specific and tales of woe, or however you like it, as possible, and not get too much into high-level generalities and theories and like that. So hopefully this will go good and be interesting for everybody. So Darren, you're first.
Darren Highfill with Utilizec. Actually, as the screen up there says, I am not Sean Paul McGurk. The hair on my head is located in a different location than his, so hopefully you can easily identify the difference. I've been doing a lot of the smart grid standards collaborative stuff for the last couple of years. Just finished up a project called the Advanced Security Acceleration Project for the smart grid, and was technical lead for that, and can generally speak to a number of utility engagements in the smart grid. As a matter of fact, Glen and I have, more to your point earlier, Glen and I have been arguing all day long, so maybe we can bring a little bit of that into the mix here. For the good news is that I do some work for Southern California Edison as well. So.
Good afternoon. I'm Matt Light. I'm the program manager of the electricity subsector risk management process guideline, as well as the electricity subsector cybersecurity risk management maturity model. Cybersecurity risk management maturity model. Did I get all that? I get them sometimes confused. It's a lot of acronyms. We go with RMP for short and ESC2M2. Those two efforts have really been collaborative efforts, both across the government and the interagency, as well as with industry partners. That's really DOE's role. I work at the Department of Energy, Office of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability. So we tend to pull players together, get the right players from across industry, and as well as the interagency, NIST and others, to really tackle some of these cybersecurity challenges in this space. Specifically, this session is titled Risk Management in the Cybersecurity Space.
I'm Tim Roxey, Chief Cybersecurity Officer for North American Electric Reliability Corporation, and the Director of the Information, the ESISEC, the Information Sharing and Analytics Center. There you go. It's been a long couple of weeks. So 35 years experience doing stuff in a variety of different areas, written operating systems, blah, 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 all that kind of fun stuff. And then I come to NERC and I settle down in an organization that, lo and behold, writes standards and also does this thing called compliance management and enforcement through a function called audits. And you find out that when you write standards and you do compliance management and enforcement through a function called audits, it gets people's attention. It turns out that the attention stops at the edge of the bulk power system. How convenient for the smart grid edge folk, right? However, the bulk power system can see aggregated impact, very large numbers of essentially homogeneous devices that have homogeneous attack surfaces and could potentially be homogeneously attacked through those homogeneous attack surfaces, all going away at once and coming back at once, and going away at once and coming back at once. This aggregated impact was discussed in a document, I believe, to a GAO report that we were requested to write several years back. It's available online somewhere. Just type aggregated impact and NERC, maybe GAO into Google or your engine of choice, and you should be able to find it. It's a fairly interesting read, but that's not like a direct impact. So the standards are written in such a way that they apply to things within the bulk power system, which in itself has a definition. Rev 5 is in final review right now. Hopefully it's going to pass industry ballot and go to FERC for approval, hopefully by the end of the year. So a very significant body of work. It's taken several years to do this work for the for the high side, 100,000, typically 100,000 volts and above. But it's really starting to turn the cybersecurity relevance issue in the bulk power system around. There's significant engagement across the entire North American community on implementing these standards as very best they can. And it's not just the audit thing. People are really doing an extremely good job of trying to implement them as well as they can. And it comes in two sets. So there's the cybersecurity one and what we call 693. Those are the other reliability standards, vegetation management, et cetera. So look forward to some questions. I'll have a couple of scary stories later on if you're interested.
I'm Glen Haddix. I'm the Director of Cybersecurity and Compliance at Southern Edison. I'm new to the industry. I've only been with Edison for about 6 months, and I come from 30 years at DoD, working on programs where other nations were trying real hard to get in. So I learned cyber different than most IT folks do. One of the things that I'm going to tell you is cyber in a large utility is a risk management game. We are never going to be safe. And just because you're compliant, you're not safe. One of the big things that we have to work a lot on is culture and get people to understand the threat. So when we engineer things, we engineer a lot of the threat out up front. So one of the big things I spend a lot of time on is educating people on threat vectors. What does a threat look like? How do they break stuff? And so the other thing is to teach people that they're already in the network. You know, China just stood up a huge program to build their grid, and they didn't have any research up front, but they're ready to go. I wonder where they got a lot of their data, right? So if people assume that the bad guy is in your network, then defense in depth really means something, because we will not stop everyone at the front door. And so that, you know, from a large utility, we have millions of touch points out there. That's the battle now, but as we go to smart grid, it becomes even larger because now we're going to have touch points in many more places, and it's going to change the way we defend ourselves.
I'm Erfan Ibrahim, and I'm an independent consultant in the area of smart grid, looking particularly at cybersecurity, communications, and network management. Some of the activities that I've been involved in of late, I was part of Electric Power Research Institute and their smart meter program, their cybersecurity program for about 4 years. And during that time, I had an opportunity to work closely with Darren and other folks and got to know Tim and many people in the community. And I come from an IT background, but then before that, I'm a recovering nuclear engineer. I have a degree in plasma physics, but as they say, necessity is the mother of invention. When that field collapsed about 20 years ago, as it's collapsing, it seems again, I had to find greener pastures. So I got into information technology, literally working at help desk, and worked my way up again with Pacific Bell, which is now AT&T. So I got an opportunity to look at operations hands-on. How do you manage thousands of sites on a 24/7 basis? And a lot of that know-how now is helpful in the smart grid area. So what I'm trying to do now is help companies that have technologies that are applicable to smart grid to find markets for them in the appropriate utilities, whether they're investor-owned or municipal or co-ops. And I also am running this educational forum and this webcast that is occurring right now as a way of sharing the information, because I feel that in particular in cybersecurity, but just generally in smart grid, there's quite a knowledge gap. A lot of people heard the buzzwords, jumped on the bandwagon, but they may not necessarily have the appropriate background. So it's good to get the synergy from the different verticals, but it's important to have the basic building blocks on what constitutes cybersecurity when it comes to power systems. How is it different from the way we look at enterprise IT? What are we going to do with, as you were mentioning, all these intelligent devices that may not necessarily be in a physically secure location, that has networking and it has wireless communication in many places. So I hope through the discussion we're going to be talking about the layers of security and the need for creating awareness not only in the customers but also in the employees of the utilities so that they're more security aware. So I hope we could talk a little bit about that as a part of the risk management.
So I think we kind of drifted progressively as we went down the line from introductions to blending in the introductory statements. So Bob actually asked if I wanted to jump back in here, so I'll try to keep it fairly brief and just say that actually I'll give a pitch for a book that I just read that I think is probably one of the more important pieces that I've seen come out relevant to this industry recently. It's a book by a gentleman by the name of Ralph Langner. Ralph actually was one of the first people to really peel open Stuxnet and figure out what was going on inside Stuxnet. This was before the large firms that I won't name came out with all the white papers about it and thorough decomposition, but he had a real good idea of what was going on with it. And he's written a book called Robust Control System Networks, and it's about control in the age after Stuxnet. And his primary points in it are actually that we've done a great job over time of being good control system and power system engineers, but then when we started bringing communications into the mix, somehow or another we tossed out our engineering hat and just started gluing things together. We lost all of our discipline about actually what it takes to make systems work and the rigor and robustness that goes into designing these systems. We do it well from an engineering, from a process control, from a power engineering standpoint. We're horrible at it from a communication standpoint. And that what we need to do is start bringing that discipline back into the mix, start looking at how these systems are constructed, how we document those systems, bring the same formality and rigor to the entire construction of the entire system, including communication networks, that we do to the control systems and power systems themselves.
Sure. I mean, I'll just echo some of the points that have already been made. And one of them, the major driver for the RMP was, in fact, this convergence between IT and the control systems, and recognizing that that convergence is happening. It's happening very rapidly, and that we do need to put more rigor into the processes and when we look at these systems and understanding what the impacts, what the risk exposure is from a cybersecurity perspective when these two worlds kind of come together. I think the other challenge we've really seen out there is that there's a huge diversity within the electric power industry. And it's important for everybody to be aware. So again, that education, that outreach, that awareness activity is incredibly important, and information sharing is incredibly important. One of the goals of the maturity model is to allow organizations of varying size and varying capability to begin to exchange information, so that you can recognize an organization that may be very strong in one practice. They can share that with the others who may be trying to build a program around that practice. So it really facilitates that type of communication, gets everybody stronger, the industry gets stronger, and the nation more secure. That's really what we're trying to establish here and some of the challenges we're tackling.
Okay, thanks. So, yeah, Mike.
Your point really resonated. So, I totally.
We'll have him up here.
I totally agree with you that we need to look at when we're designing these systems. Okay, we need to build them more robust, just like the systems prior to the addition of communications were built with very robust. And in fact, if you look at some of the old analog systems that have been around for 100 years, that's just evidence that they were very well built, right? And I'm starting to see, I think we're all starting to see in the vendor community, bit by bit in the ICS world, maybe not as fast as it should be, a little better attention being paid to the way you build communication stacks and securing them. I think the issue from a risk management perspective that we run into is where we define the demarcation point. We're looking at a management project, okay? We simply draw the demarcation point around a certain area, but they forget that it connects to a legacy system where everything's been tagged on, added on, and that's where the problem is. And it's often quite easy to make that jump from the secure, system to the new secure system to the old system where it's been tagged on, and frankly, it's just not ever going to be as good. So from a risk management perspective, how do you get people to understand you got to include that, you've got to extend that demarcation point?
So I think the real problem is the answer to that is not sexy. The answer to that is that we have to eat our peas, that we have to do the exhaustive documentation of what functionality we need, how the system is built, put all of that under rigorous change management, so that you don't have one part of the organization that's responsible for the mechanics of this widget over here, and another part of the organization that's responsible for another part of the conveyor belt, and yet a third one that's responsible for getting visibility of those two things back into the enterprise. As soon as you start splitting up, that kind of functionality, it becomes real challenging from an organizational standpoint to be able to frame all of that in any kind of risk management context, because fundamentally your organizational structures are fighting you, and your organizational politics are fighting you. If we don't want to accept that, we don't want to go do the super exciting stuff of documenting how the system's supposed to function and documenting all of the connections and services you need, and doing the change management control. We're not going to get over the hump.
So Glenn, how does that play out in your experience?
Well, actually, when you're running a very large network, one of the biggest problems you have is what you know and what you don't know. And everybody assumes they know everything. Turns out that the biggest things you need to do is you need to draw out your network and know where you can see things and where you can't see things. And where you can't see things, you make sure you work real fast to get eyes on there. And then you work to segment your topography. Because if you don't, if you get infected or if you get an intruder in your network, you can't control where they go. So segmentation is very important. Knowing where you can see things. And then you can play a nice little game with the engineers. And it works out to be a great awareness thing. I call it drop the rock. When you say if a intruder were to show up in this place, either through a thumb drive or actual breach, how would you know it? What would they look like? Where could they go? And then once you start doing that, you change the awareness section. Because if you talk to application engineers and stuff, everybody views this in a different paradigm. One of the things you got to do in the cyber risk is you look down upon, you don't look up any verticals. So you know what things are going on in your borders, and do you know how to detect them? Do you know where the valuable things are? And you force architectural change into simplicity, because everybody wants, every business part of your organization wants their own stuff. That is the most dangerous thing in IT risk for cyber, because if you keep cloning stuff, the likelihood of somebody stealing it goes way up, or exploiting it. You're driving them to common services, common protection is a day-to-day thing, and it's a cultural thing, because it's always more fun if I control all my own assets, not realizing that what you may be doing is exposing risk. And so my big thing with a lot of this is, yes, there's always documentation, but when you ask people to take different looks at the topography, they always look at it as application, where boxes are. I look at it as, where are dark zones? Where am I segmented? Where are the paths to the crown jewels? Because if you don't look at those things, you're not thinking like the attacker. Because they're not coming in just for the heck of it, they're coming in for a reason. If you know these kind of things, you can control what you know and what you don't know.
So I'm going to extend the logic a little further. Cybersecurity is a lot of people look at technologies and talk about cybersecurity technologies, but really there's an art to cybersecurity. And the art is the art of systemic thinking, that a lot of these applications that we call smart grid, whether it be demand response or wide area monitoring, protection, and control, you know, the FERC 4+2, if you really look at them and say, exactly how many touch points do these applications have across the domains of the smart grid as defined in the NIST interoperability roadmap project, you find that they cross many, many lines. And in order to secure these applications, because after all, ultimately they are the economic generator. Those applications, when customers interact with them, generate the dollars that pays for everything. So if you take that systemic view, and then I'll make a plug for this maturity model, because what you have essentially through this maturity model is a way to break that problem up. If you just keep thinking and talking in abstract about a system, of course, you're never going to solve a problem. So you have to think global, systemically, but act local, and put in the pieces that create that overall systemic view with the layered defense and keeping the economic engine in mind, rather than the other way, which is, I'm a technology connoisseur and I have this much budget to spend on cybersecurity technology, so I'm going to find the best gadget to put on my infrastructure. So I would say that when it comes to the integration with legacy, having that systemic view can quickly allow you to do the gap analysis using the maturity model.
Thanks. Okay, so let me change tracks here just a little bit. I'm going to throw this out to all of you and actually to everybody else. Do you believe that we have all the pieces in place to build a secure control network? Does everything exist? What are we missing? We've already got people shaking their heads no. So
are we permitted to scoff?
You can scoff, guffaw, whatever. Yeah. So Glenn, you shook your head no first, so you get to go first.
Well, right now we have tens of thousands of touch points. As we go to the smart grid, essentially every home in the United States is going to be every utility's touch point, because we'll be interconnected. One of the things that we also have to look at is the utilities don't build boxes. We have to get out to manufacturers a secure kernel that's going to be our touch point that goes into the grid. We have to control the entry point, and we have a program called CCS, which we've been working on, that would be given out to manufacturers, because if we don't control that touch point, we will spend more money trying to secure the grid than it will for equipment for the grid. So that is the #1 challenge going out that way. We know there are several other people working on similar things. The part of the problem right now, specifications won't save us there because the one-offs will kill us in integration. So that, I'd say, is probably our weakest point right now going to the grid, securing it, because we don't have a common interface. Just like phones use, they take a secure kernel or an OS and they build apps on top of it. What we really lack is the secure kernel so that our industry partners can build apps on to provide applications for our customer base out throughout homes in the United States.
Tim, you're next. Scoff.
Well, I don't mean to scoff, but over the past 35 years, I've watched some evolutions that are troubling, and it really goes back into complexity theory. Not to get too theoretical, but there's some issues there. And we started out with a guy named Fred and his dog who worked in substations, and if you wanted to do an adjustment from the control room, which was a board painted on a wall with push pins, right, you would call Fred on a phone that had a rotary dial. And we understood this technology. The enemies of my enemies were not my friends in those days, and my enemies had to break down a secure place. That's why Fred had his dog. So there's this paradigm shift as we moved from simple to the form, simple to the function technologies of a phone, a push pin, and a control system that was positive in its ability to go from one state to another. Absolutely knew it cold. We then installed multifunction processing devices built upon operating systems from one vendor, an application stack from another, a comm stack from a third, using chips, foreign deployed, foreign manufactured, God knows what they are, right? But you have got such a degree of complexity built within the structure of your technological base of all of it, smart grid included, that you can actually have memory resident software running in your applications on your OSs that your OS is not aware of. This is why it takes you 24 months to go backwards after you detect the fact, oh my God, I've been breached. This is on your enterprise side, right? On your ICS side, we don't even have that much skill set yet in the complexities that are coming at us in just these amazingly complex little operating systems that are embedded on firmware. If you think you own it, you don't. When people ask me what's some of my bigger fears, well, tree branches, obviously, I worry about those. But one of my bigger fears is that the core components of the telecommunication systems, which, by the way, is your internet service providers, which, by the way, is the internet, right? The core components of that are offshore manufactured. Some of them have been found to have other things on them. This is an interesting thing, and we're going to build an infrastructure on these communication pathways. I would submit that probably within the next 15 to 20 years, you're going to see what some of us are calling the brittle edge. It's a construct in fractal theory when you get to a point where the complexity is so great you can no longer see the points, right? It just looks like a pattern. And when you look at it, you can't see it, right? So when you hit the brittle edge, what happens? You have a collapse. You actually get to the point where you cannot understand the interrelationships of the technology because you have given certain autonomous control functions to pieces of this. Think about the distributed requirements associated, the functional requirements, right? Very important. You got to know what you're trying to do because when this thing starts doing something different, you're going to have to try and figure it out. Great Britain, years ago, had this massive fluctuation in power, north and south. Go figure, they're kind of a north and south island. That was a tough one for the control systems to deal with because they were trying to automatically control that, and they couldn't. Well, add an aggressive adversary in there with full malice of forethought, and all of a sudden you have a different mix. So the end of this story is complexity in some cases is not your friend. Sometimes simple to the form or simple to the function is your friend. We spent tons of time in the 90s trying to harden operating systems by killing off all the little DLLs. I would submit that in some of the smart grid technology, clearly in some of the enterprise technology, we've gone the other way. We have a lot of functionality in these boxes. We don't necessarily use it off of that function. Simple to the form where you specified the requirement to execute. You don't need all the others, remove it.
Tim, I'd actually I'd even go. I love the fact that you brought up, the Fred and his dog, because that's absolutely perfect. Because I really think that where we started to lose the bubble was when we started to introduce the abstractions and the virtualization of logic, where logic is no longer physically constructed in the device, but it is programmed somehow or another. And guess what? If it was programmed at one point in time, it can be programmed again. And I think somehow or another we've been in this denial of how ethereal all of what we are building is. All of this code, all of these pieces of equipment that we're deploying, that we have this idea that we've built a control system and that it's gonna be there because we've invested all of these hours and years in it. And the reality is that tomorrow it could be completely and totally wiped by something as simple as a magnet. And that the fact that we somehow or another are in denial of how delicate all those things are, and our need to get back to having the ability to gracefully fall back to Fred and his dog, is something that we really need in the control systems world.
So a lot of these systems are built with a whole bunch of functionality on it, because at the time that they're in the early design phase, 3 to 5 years away from deployment to the field, right? The design engineers are going, I need this kind of a chip, I need that kind of a chip, I need these kind of a circuits and this kind of a function, and he buys all of these multifunction processors and plugs them in, and then he specializes through software how it's supposed to behave. The systems of systems, not the system, but the system of systems starts to become so complex. Patrick Miller put a point to this one time, which was great. The logical distance between the clicky-clicky and the whirly-whirly has expanded exponentially. Right? I thought about that for the longest time, and it's like, you're absolutely right. When I was a child, I clicked the button. I could walk along the wires to the relay on this high-energy physics thing that I was working on and see a relay work. Now, you can't even predict what path it's going through.
Go ahead. I was going to highlight one other piece, because it's the piece that I like to work on the most, and that's the people piece. And I think it's important that we both recognize that our workforce needs to be capable and needs to be educated to be able to understand these complex problems. And it requires, I think, a lot broader education than traditionally we've had. We're looking at control systems and IT and the convergence of the two, and you've got to be able to understand both of those worlds and how they match up with one another. So it's also about organizations and people within organizations and how these organizations function to understand the risk. If we can't effectively as organizations, that's what it all boils down to, understand these risks and scope them, then we can't properly respond to them. So it's incredibly important that we have an educated workforce and organizations that are aligned to properly address this risk.
Okay, one more comment, and then we'll go to an audience question.
Okay. So in answer to your question, do we have the wherewithal? I would say that our challenge in cybersecurity is not so much a technology problem. And I can tell that because I deal a lot with startup type companies in this space who are trying to come in and sell their wares to the utility industry. And I'm finding that they're sitting in the 99.999 percentile in terms of what they're going to contribute to the cybersecurity posture. And what I'm finding largely as a challenge in cybersecurity and smart grid are mental models of people. There's so much bias that they're bringing from their past experiences that they're not able to shed it, and it actually becomes an impediment. I'll give you a very simple example. Moore's law. Okay, Moore's law is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's great that you're bringing more and more computation into smaller and smaller size, and therefore you can put sensors where previously they were big devices, now you have little ones. In that sense, it's wonderful. But where people start thinking, oh, because of Moore's law, I can consolidate stuff. I can put, you know, quad-core processors and all that, and I have broadband, and I can siphon all this data back, and it'll be crunch, and then I'll have this data mart, and I will store all of that. What you start realizing is if you move in that direction, you're looking for that needle in the haystack when it comes to hackers and what they do, because they love the idea that there's a lot of noise, and that's why when you talk about segmentation of the network, you know, to quiet it down so that you can see an anomaly. So what I'm seeing is that well-intentioned people coming from this chip manufacturing history are now trying to drive this revolution through smart grid, saying the answer to everything is if you process more. Whereas I would say that it's more about proactive thinking and proper architecture, layering the thing, distributing the intelligence, having summaries, you know, make it elegant rather than being exhaustive, even like with network intrusion detection. Simple things. If you put that on a gigabit pipe and then watch how many false positives you're going to catch, you're going to overwhelm yourself. So my answer is technology we have. Let's try to use it intelligently and break some of these models.
Thanks. Okay, we have an audience question.
Yeah, Ralph Martinez. I'm with the Regional Cyber and Energy Security Center, University of Texas at El Paso. One of the questions we have is in a vulnerability analysis for utilities or within utilities for cybersecurity, how does the utility identify what is a critical asset? And what is that? How is that critical asset built into the threat analysis and the vulnerability analysis?
Well, since you're talking, golly day, since you're talking critical asset, that kind of falls in my bailiwick, and I'll kind of dodge it a little bit. In the early days, it was what was considered critical was things that if maloperated or lost would have an impact to the reliability of the bulk power system. And there was some subjectivity to it. There was a little bit of objectivity to it, and through a long process of standard development, drafting teamwork, and a lot of conversation throughout the regions and the audit processes, it was discovered that there were some issues around identification because it's confusing. It's hard to understand if a 500 megawatt plant in one location is critical and a 1,000 megawatt plant in another location is not. So over a period of evolution, and really this is out of my swim lane, so some of this may be wrong, but over a period of evolution, version 4 of the standards, which was just recently approved by FERC, we went to what's called a Brightline Criteria, and the Brightline Criteria defines if you're this, you're in. If you're not, if you're this, you're not. Right. So the Brightline Criteria is there. The Brightline Criteria is being adjusted now, but criticality. If I could speak to it in a broader framework that would bring in, I think, the smart grid components. And I'll use a little bit of a nuclear example. For instance, in nuclear power plants, we are exquisitely focused on safety. You wake up in the morning and safety is on your cup of coffee. You go to bed at night, safety is on your pillow. Right? It's something that nuclear engineers, it's our life. So any system which could be compromised, any cyber system which could be compromised, and through that compromise could stop you from responding to an accident or cause some form of a radiological breach, that is a safety significant issue. 10 CFR 7354, I believe, Code of Federal Regulations, Title 10, that's the NRC space. Those are hardline regulations. There's Reg Guide 5.71, I believe, underneath of that talks about the guidance to industry about how to find these devices, what they are, how to determine the significance of the device, high, medium, low, very NIST-like, right? High, medium, low. NIST-like is the appropriate term, correct? Yeah. So very NIST-like. So you have now this huge amount of controls, configuration management, training, background screening, access, physical access, cyber, that you apply to those devices. And then the NRC does inspections to ensure that. I don't know if that's been done yet. I'm not kind of core to the smart grid. I'll leave that to the other panel members who are. But in my mind, things that would be critical in the smart grid community are look very carefully at those huge numbers of homogeneous attack surfaces that are rolling out. Number two, look at your mesh networks and determine which components of your mesh networks and your front-end processors are critical to the functioning of the smart grid. Now, is it a safety significant issue? Perhaps not. Is it a dollar value significant issue? Possibly so. So you have different ways of viewing criticality. So the vulnerability assessment would actually say, is it a safety assessment? In other words, am I going to damage 100,000 meters and put them out of commission for like forever, and I'll have to replace them, and it's going to take me weeks to a month to do so, which could impact the residential ability to stay inside your residence for that time? Or is it something just more economic? So your vulnerability assessment would cascade down through these different risk categorizations, and the devices may change depending on the risk categorization as to what is in scope or out of scope for a particular assessment.
Okay, so thanks for, Tim, thanks for an awesome, relatively politically correct NERC answer. Let me risk Glenn murdering me after the session here and go politically incorrect on my answer here and say that unfortunately, whether something was designated as a critical asset or critical cyber asset, at least under the old rules or not, and some of this still applies with the new rules, but at least under the old rules, the problem is that that you had politics and money in the equation, not just technicality. That declaring something as a critical cyber asset or a critical asset, and therefore that dictated the critical cyber assets. Declaring something as a critical asset meant that you had a tremendous amount more exposure and liability from not from a technical operational risk standpoint, but from a legal standpoint. And that if you get to that point in the organization where you're presented with a very simple question of, okay, if we designate this as a critical asset, you know, we have this much more liability, this much more legal exposure, this many more obligations, versus if we don't designate it as one, then we get to, you know, to not be exposed to that bullet. It becomes, you know, you have some non-technical issues that start driving an unfortunately large portion of the equation. Now, there are some utilities I've been fortunate enough to work with that have looked at this and been far enough along on the cybersecurity capability spectrum that they say, okay, I've already got the capability to meet all of the controls that are required if I declare it a critical asset. So actually the increased exposure to me is not that great, and actually it's more politically advantageous for me to, and from a PR perspective, to be just forthcoming and say, yes, we believe this is a critical asset, it needs to be protected. We're protecting it anyway, so it's a non-issue. So unfortunately, that's a relatively small portion of the space out there, at least that I've seen.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I can't really comment a lot on the direct relationships there that you mentioned, because I am in literally a different swim lane. However, based on my experience, the vulnerability assessments that you should be doing, obviously in the smart grid world, they're not SIP related necessarily. They're something else related, risk management guidelines being one good example. It's the construct that you just talked about. If you take the political and the technical and separate them for a moment, it's the risk to the business enterprise associated with something happening to the business enterprise because of a cyber-mediated means. There are very few critical infrastructure sectors in the 18 that are actually regulated relative to cybersecurity. I can name them on the thumbs of two hands. right? If I throw a third one in there, I can even throw in the chemical sector. But there are very few. It's the nuclear sector under Title 10. It's the bulk power system under Section 215 of the Federal Power Act. And it's CFATS, tiny little piece, for the chemical community. Now, oh yeah, the EPA does have a touch on water sector. TSA has just a little inkling coming in. So scrape that away and pretend like you care about your enterprise. Because I think all of us fundamentally care about our enterprise. There's a risk to your enterprise. Many times in some sectors, you do not know what your critical components are because you have not done, as the gentleman's question led us to this, you have not done the vulnerability assessment by asking yourself, what are the critical components that I cannot have my lemonade stand functioning with if I don't have it? A pitcher, a cup, a cute little girl on the side of a road, right? That's my enterprise. What pieces of that can I afford to lose and she doesn't make her money that day? It's simple stuff. It's safety, it's economics, and then yes, it is regulatory for those few sectors that actually have a regulatory footprint.
Okay, so Glenn, murder or does he survive?
He'll live another day.
Okay. Any comments you want to add to that? Or?
No, most of, as I see working with my peers, most of the large utilities are very conservative. So if we think something is a critical asset, we designate it as a critical asset. But the biggest thing is we're constantly doing threat analysis against denial of service to our customer base. So it could be safety, it could be a cyber attack on a non-NERC device. To us, we have to keep the lights on. So we work really hard at keeping that posture up all the time.
Just a quick comment on critical asset. That concept is changing as we are deploying smart grid applications. And going back to that systemic view, the concept of the asset has to be seen and the totality of the application and the impact if that application is not working, rather than just a bunch of boxes or a bunch of systems. So for instance, I'll give you a very simple example. Let's say there's an aggregator that is working in conjunction with a utility to provide megawatts during peak time. And let's say that they have signed up enough customers that they can reach that 300 megawatt threshold that you have from NERC for it to be critical. It's not a generation source, but megawatt at a time of peak power is a critical asset if you think about it. Because if you don't provide that saving at that time, you're going to have problems with the reliability of your system during that peak time. But today, there is nothing that controls that, calls it a critical asset, and therefore has some kind of regulation on it. So what I would suggest, and by the way, that is a huge footprint on which that would happen. And there would be many, many components collectively that would create that savings. So that's why I would say that the paradigm is shifting on what is considered a critical asset because of these new applications that we're seeing.
I did want to throw in, I know we're going to go to an audience question here very quickly, but I want to throw in one more thing. I know my eyes are not what they used to be, but I'm not seeing Chris back there as he ducks. I wanted to point out that as Tim, as you ran down what the federal level regulations are here, that at least for the electric power utility, and I assume for the other entities as well, maybe not nuclear, but at least electric power, federal is not the only game in the mix as well. We have the state regulations that are also in the mix and very much are relevant to the scope of the smart grid. And obviously a much more entertaining question when you have a few more regulatory regimes.
I just cannot, for the life of me, keep up with 50 states, 7 or 8 provinces, a couple of territories. It's beyond me.
Okay, so how many questions did we have out here? Mike?
Yeah, and if we could have the people come and use the mic so that the people on the webcast can hear the question, that would be great.
Come on, don't be bashful, Mike. Come on.
And it's like Toastmasters,
So
you speak when you're in front of the microphone. There.
So I have a question about Brightline. So So essentially, with Brightline, what we're talking about is, you look at certain criteria and determine whether or not something is in or out from a NERC SIP perspective, correct? I guess the question I have is, and I'm thinking a little bit like an attacker here, because that's what I do, as many of us probably do, is if the issue is with some of these things that fall outside of Brightline, let's say there's assets which have, a certain vendor problem, and it's all common, right? And it's something which can be exploited en masse at once. Each one of these assets, okay, falls outside of Brightline criteria, but aggregated, all of a sudden we got a problem. So if you can actually mount a big attack over, let's say, a wireless communication network and hit all of this stuff at once, put some sort of a worm-through system, whatever it may be, all of a sudden, taken together, they're a central asset.
So imagine a triangle. Bottom quarter of the triangle is basic risk controls. These are CFATs. This is Title 10 Code of Federal Regulation. This is Power Act, Federal Power Act. This is whatever your standards are. You implement them and you control behavior within there to manage your risk as best you can for that. The things you're talking about are the exploits of vulnerabilities. A little bit of the conversation I was having earlier is we don't know. I think the gentleman said the unknown, the known. We know what we know and we don't know what we don't know, right? So in that world of the we don't know what we don't know, guess what? It's massively more scaled up than you can possibly imagine. We know very little. So the vulnerability comes along. We discover it as an O-day from somewhere. We've been getting these right and left over the last 2 months. What do we do, right? We've got these critical and non-critical assets scattered throughout the bulk power system. You have smart grid stuff going on all over the place. What do we do? Well, it's a surge control. You understand, you work with the vendor, you identify the attack surface being exploited, you work with the intelligence community to understand, is it real? And you figure out the mitigation strategies, and then you do a surge risk control, which is an alert, a notification, or whatever your sector has. Industrial control systems, CERT team, the U.S. CERT team, Canadian CERT team, et cetera, all around the globe. This happens all the time. I'm getting ready to push an alert tomorrow on something that was compromised on September 10th. For those who know about it, you know about it. For those who don't, you'll read about it tomorrow.
And so I think part of that is that your organization has to be prepared to quickly respond and adapt to the situation. And they have to already be aligned to do it. You have to have an understanding of what do I have, how does it operate, and how does this apply to me, and to be able to quickly respond to that. You've got to have connections with both the government partners, your industry partners, your neighbors, so that you can do vendors, so you can talk to one another and quickly and communicate with one another. But you have to have that all established before something happens. To do it when the disaster strikes, you're not going to be able to quickly maneuver and get yourself in a much better position. You're going to be overwhelmed by the event unless you do the preparedness ahead of time and align yourself to respond.
Well, the thing that I see so often in my research is the two probably least addressed areas are incident response and backup and recovery. And if you look at it, if you think about it, if you're a security researcher, do you want to spend time building an incident database or developing a new encryption algorithm, right? So what are you going to do? So we've got lots of people going to the real techie solutions, but the stuff that keeps you running, was it PG&E yesterday said we got 75 terabytes of interval data growing by 2 terabytes a month, and I'm thinking, I wonder how backup and recovery works on that. It's a challenge.
So if I could give a real world event about backup and recovery, okay, oil and natural gas sector has been taking up whipping over the last 3 months, easy 4 months probably. We've pushed alerts out through NERC. We've seen ICS CERT, US CERT push alerts out. So what happened on old man memory, August 18th, that would be significant? 30,000 desktops disappeared on the world's largest oil producer. Aramco, right? Who owns Aramco? Saudi Arabia. How happy are they? They're not real happy. 10 days later, what happened? An undisclosed number of desktops disappeared in a company called RasGas. Why do we care about RasGas? Saudi Arabia's Aramco had old guys rummaging around in the warehouses trying to find what? Fax machines, telex machines, because they were taken back to, relatively speaking, the Stone Age, or at least the Bronze Age, right? RASGAS, same thing, 10 days later, undisclosed number of desktops get ripped down. What was festive about this one is how they were ripped down. They were ripped down with a piece of malware named Shamoon. And you should look this one up because it is really good. It takes at least one glass of Merlot to be able to really enjoy this play. But go to YouTube, type in shamoon.mov, and sit back and enjoy. And think about your enterprise. Critical system, non-critical system, industrial control side, non-industrial control side, does not matter. Watch what this guy does. He goes, he captures Shamoon, puts it in a virtual machine so he can play with it more often than just once, right? And then he watches the machine strip itself down. The software kills the master boot record, erases a certain set of files really well, and then it starts stripping down. And when it hits the ICO files, you know, the icon files, it was gonna try and put in a burning US flag. How festive, thank you very much. But they made a mistake. It only put in the top 4 or 5 lines of the image of a burning US flag. So sad, so bad. So that means we're not working with the A team. We're not working with the B or C team. We probably got the D team, but the D team managed to tear down 2 of the world's largest energy suppliers and push them back into the Bronze Age. So that's never been done, to my knowledge, in some of our exercises. I had an entity come up to me recently and say, you know what? I'm going to do that one next time. When we start the exercise, I'm going to walk around the table and turn 9 out of every 10 laptops off and say, let's play. That is a real world event. That is significant. We did push an alert on that, and that does go to backups because they are still struggling to recover those boxes.
So you had asked about the unknown attack. We face the unknown attack every day. So what you do is you defend yourself against attack vectors. Because if you react to every attack, you will go broke and you will always be repairing stuff. So you study the attack mechanisms, and like I said before, you do very well at segmentation. You may not stop the attack, but you'll minimize the damage from the attack. And that's the best defense we have these days. We work very closely with our industry partners, our government partners. But remember, when they call and tell us that something happens, there's always the first victim. You're glad that you got the call and you weren't making the call. But the first one comes right through virus detectors and most firewalls and things of that nature because it doesn't show up on anybody's radar. So if you assume they can get through like that, then you set up for isolations and automatic defenses. And if you know that you have a series of devices, if they were all taken control of, or a device that has a master control that could be isolated, you make sure you put in defenses that if it's isolated, it can't be used against you. And that takes a lot more system engineering, and it takes time to educate people to look for these vulnerabilities.
So a couple of mechanics to address. One of the customers that I'm working with is Citer Corporation, and what they have been doing is serving the defense and intelligence agencies for the last 30 years. And I'm trying to bring some of those lessons learned from that industry to the energy industry because they're constantly concerned about coordinated attacks where there could be many threat surfaces where you could have a coordinated attack on. A couple of logistical things. One is that, and NIST has done a very good job of bringing all these use cases together. I think it's really important that when you are trying to secure an application, that you document the proper use cases to see how you're going to use the application, because that will really define which interfaces are going to get exercised. And then to make sure that you have the proper mitigations for the threats that you have identified on those places. Now, in some cases, you may have a standard specification that gives you those controls, but where you don't, because the standard is still evolving, you got to still nail it down with some security control and work with the standards bodies to make sure that those controls are there. The DNP folks, for instance, have done a very good job of working with the cybersecurity community, with the NIST Cybersecurity Working Group to put a lot of those controls in place. But you're still not done. You've protected the interfaces, but the hackers are looking for the weakest link, and sometimes that may be the system itself. It could be the CPU, it could be the buffers, it could be other things besides those interfaces in which you're interacting. So then you have to start thinking about how you're going to secure the system as a whole. So if you follow this progression and use the lessons learned from the industry, pick up the documents from the DHS, ICS, JWG working group, and the NIST 7628, and this risk management and the maturity model, and start creating a Venn diagram for yourself to show what parts fit where, so that you can see if there are any holes in your jigsaw puzzle. I think quite often we go off in all these initiatives and we create different manifestations of reality, and then we have to provide consulting hours to the utilities to try to piece it all together. And I would suggest that if somebody has done something like that, share it, so that the next person doesn't have to go through that laborious process.
I would actually say that if you're interested in that diagram and you're a recipient of American Reinvestment and Recovery Act funds, come to the December workshop, you're likely to see something.
I think the problem is probably worse than we're willing to admit, is you've got a consultant complaining that there's too much consulting work needed. I had a question. You were talking about looking for the weakest link in that. Sometimes you hear people saying, well, you know, we've got this interconnected grid or grids, however you want to look at it, and you may have, you know, Southern California, Edison's going to be well protected, but you got much smaller munis and co-ops. Is that a risk, the fact that they don't have the same level of protection that you have?
Of course, as we move more to the smart grid, in California, we could fall victim to somebody on the East Coast. That's when we go to the smart grid, we'll be interconnected. So that's why we have to work more closely together to come up with common defense mechanisms. And that's working now. We have things through EEI and Unite where we're starting to work down this path. That's one of the reasons we came up with CCS. We have to have a buffer between us and commercially sold things that we can protect ourselves from, you know, devices we may not know the origins of.
No, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, please.
You have to look at the grid as a very large interconnected area. There's this group of folks called balancing authorities that work very hard within 15-minute blocks of time to make sure that the load and generation stays synced. There's other groups called reliability coordinators, about 16 to 18 of them. I'm a little out of my swim lane here, but 16 to 18 of them. These are the organizations which have the ultimate authority to manage the bulk power system. And then you have to ask yourself, when you get 330 million humans living on 4 interconnected grids, so you have the East Coast, the West Coast, the Texas state, and then Quebec, when you have these interconnected interconnects, these are very massive interconnects managed by groups of 16, managed through balancing authorities of many, many. It's a complex system, but that complex system, I would submit to you right now, is the most reliable machine on this planet of its size. It's certainly the most reliable synchronous machine on this planet of its size. And some of the complexities that we discuss, and something I would urge you to keep your eyes on, are the interplay between the industrial control system, control function of smart grid, and how it interacts with the balancing authorities and reliability coordinators, in particular within the interconnects. And that's a conversation I know that the regional administrators, all 8 of them, plus NERC, have been having a very robust conversation on.
And I think that's an important point there, is that, I mean, all these utilities are used to coordinating with one another and working very closely when it comes to the electrons flowing back and forth. They manage that interaction in real time on an ongoing basis. What we need to establish is that type of coordination and communication with the technology folks, the folks that are implementing the technologies, developing the architectures and so on. And you need to understand, what is your neighbor's risk? What type of defenses that they set up so that you can understand then where you are in relation to that. And so I think we're just trying, a lot of what we've been working on in the last few years is to establish that type of coordination communication amongst the utilities that they already have when it comes to power operations, but move it over into the control systems IT technology space.
So just real quick, just because we are inter-networked or getting there, doesn't mean that all information needs to go from everywhere to everywhere. That's just a facility. We have to still stick to our well-established ways of disseminating information on a need-to-know basis. Just because we have an IP addressing scheme that allows us to read something doesn't mean that it should provide us the service because we got there. And there should be barriers along the way saying, what are you doing going over there? Who are you? So the proper authentication and authorization, and as you were mentioning, the concept of segmentation, by the function. Who are you? What is the realm of what you do? I think that layer needs to be put on top of just technology that is allowing. It's great to have that facility. And if you look at the telecom industry and you see the supervisory channel in that ESS7, if you remember how the service provider could actually use that channel to control the network, but to the users, they were completely oblivious to that supervisory channel. So maybe, the government needs that supervisory channel to get across, to get that situational awareness, but an average person doesn't need to use that.
I might just take the winkiest bit of objection to the government having a control channel. I believe I heard one president say that he was searching for something along the lines of an internet kill switch. I want to turn the internet off. Can you do that? And I've seen multiple exercises, one in particular, cabinet level exercise, where this concept was out there. 85 to 90 some odd % of the bulk power system is in private sector hands. It crosses 68,000 units of governance across counties, cities, munis, countries, right? So, and forgive me, I'm kind of a weensy bit Native American, so let's not forget the tribals as well. So 68,000 different forms of governance is an exquisitely dangerous thing to give control over something that literally is intertied with all of the other critical infrastructure. This is why a brilliant stroke as they started to pull the internet interconnect together was to identify the reliability coordinators and go through a very arduous process of making sure that the reliability coordinators are the ultimate authority on how the grid functions. They're the ones who are in the catbird seat, period. Now, I like the idea of the D7. I like the supervisory channel. I think that idea has value, but the people that I would give that value to is the reliability coordinators and not the government, because the government is right into the middle of the question of which government, how often, what kind of control, what's the privacy concerns, and you will spend the rest of my career, which hopefully won't be terribly long, but certainly all of it, you'll spend the rest of my career trying to determine that, whereas it would be a relatively easy lift for people within the smart grid community to try and articulate what would a D7 channel look like, what would it carry, what kind of information would it have, and what kind of control request would you make across that type of a channel, and then give that authority to the people at the tail end of the bulk power system right up against the distribution edge called the reliability coordinators. Let them be on the catbird seat where they are right now. They're extremely well trained. As you can see, the lights are on. And the ability for you to think that you'll have a light turn on every single time you hit a switch, that is not common across this planet. That is absolutely common within the North American grid.
Yeah, I have to apologize. I was born and raised in a dictatorship, so I'm not used to a federal government. And
but we love you, Dan.
Yeah. But just I was looking for a dance partner to the hacker who wants to do the coordinated attack nationally, but the good guy on the other side.
So when we got to the part of this conversation where we're talking about exchanging information between utilities and what the different utilities are going to do with that information, which information should be exchanged, and how to protect that information. It occurred to me, just out of curiosity, how many folks in here have been to or in an electric cooperative whose total number of employees was in the double digits? Okay, a couple. All right. So how many cybersecurity folks do they have?
It depends. He might be doing the laundry right now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I was fortunate enough to actually visit one this past summer, and and what was fascinating to me was that, you know, cybersecurity was part of one person's job. They were also the primary network and communications engineer. And then when you expanded it to a second person, basically you had all of the field communication systems of the entire utility in those two brains. And that there's a point of vulnerability there that extends beyond the information that's being exchanged between the utilities.
I can see exactly where you're headed. Little guys more dangerous because they don't have capabilities. Clearly, if they have a capability, they may not have capacity, and big guys are more okay. I would like to submit for your consideration, if I could, the Department of Defense, NSA, CIA, FERC, Department of Energy, the most technologically capable agencies in our federal government. Okay, you can probably see where I'm headed. And these most technologically capable members of just the United States, right? Let's not talk Israel, which is just uber fantastic capable, right? Or some sections of the former Soviet Union who have been hurt hard and have gotten really good, like Georgia. These people have massive capabilities and capacity that is an A, B, C, D, E, F, G on every node in their environment. And yet, you know what? Joint Strike Fighter. 2007, we lost 13 terabytes of data from those very self-same organizations. So the point I'm trying to make is, yes, we do have small people. And in my ISAC, we care deeply about those small people, which is why we hold webinars, we try to teach. Many of those people actually outsource some of their cybersecurity to large aggregated outsourcers, right? So that they recognize that, you know, when a NERC alert comes out and says you ought to do this for your SCADA system, they go, I don't know how to do that, so I'm going to call my SCADA manufacturer, and they help, right? So a lot of effort is put into helping the little folk because they are vitally important to our communities. Not just about power, it's about people, and the communities are very important to us. But even the big ones struggle. Even the large agencies struggle because your advanced adversary is really good. The numbers are stark. 24 months, when you actually detect something and you look at those indicators of compromise and you go backwards, 24 months back is the average time between the time that you were actually hacked and the time that you discovered it for .coms. .mils, .govs, these are not my numbers, right? Homeland Security's numbers, right? These are their numbers. For .govs and .mils, massively capable, huge capacities, right? Different spelling, different meaning. Capable capacity. 6 months between the time in which the compromise is detected and when you look thoroughly, forensically look back the time in which you actually detected the exploit. This is a serious problem for all of us, from one edge of the shining grid to the other, from the generation all the way out to the smart grid. And the conversation needs to be robust, needs to be often, and exactly like this. We need to make sure we speak. And part of the community that I think I would like to speak to more often than I have an opportunity to is the vendor community. Because the vendor community is matching your functional request. I would like to do this smarter, faster, and cheaper. They will give that to you, and they will give that to you in spades. But when they do that, there may be some additional functionality that you did not necessarily ask for. And that's what fuzzing attacks do. That's how you find some of these things. Malware, smart malware, not stupid malware, smart malware buried down inside your operating systems. Not too terribly long ago, there was this thing called a return on procedure call attack. I don't know if you understand these things or not, but it's a buffer overflow attack. It's a very exquisite kind of buffer overflow attack. How beautiful is that? There's an article that was written with the weirdest name of any really dense scientific article I've ever read. Innocent flesh on the bone. You have got to read this, because what this thing is trying to tell you is that without writing any code and putting it into a browser buffer, you can actually have that code, which is nothing more than a bunch of procedure calls. It's memory jumps, right? You can actually have that code build a software application out of memory resonant core fragments, right? This is the kind of super uber juju that the nation state awesome hackers can do. And you know what? That's why I'm on that little mantra I go around when I talk to people. Simple to the form, simple to the function. You need to get back to that world of the 90s where we were trying to strip down all this additional functionality of the operating system, the application, etc., so you can actually read the code. Nobody reads code anymore. Read the code. What is this doing? Oh, it's looking for a date and time from China. How festive. Or it's going to Bangladesh to verify some chipset. How festive. No. Too complex. Let's go backwards a little bit. Simple to the form, simple to the function. No.
Yeah, go ahead and follow that one. Let me switch a little bit here if I could, okay. Glenn, you had when we were talking before here, you had giving I guess a little bit of a flavor of what your day-to-day is like and what kinds of things you see and run into. Are you willing, in the interest of having 8 minutes to keep people entertained, to share a few stories with us?
Yeah, so cyber is a risk management. You're never 100% secure. So it's always a trade-off, because you don't have enough money, and if you had enough money, you wouldn't be secure anyway. And so a lot of what my day is education, don't delude yourself on what you know. You're better to assume you know less and monitor more. You educate a lot on what's the bad guy really, because there's so much false information out there on capability that you need people to understand what it really is and what it is not. And then you play little games. Cyber is boring. It's like watching paint dry. You can kill a crowd faster than anything when you want to give them cyber training.
Yeah, just look.
Right? So we make little games. The phishing attack, probably still the most effective attack there is. Calling people on the phone and asking for data. It is amazing what people will tell you when you call. Things of that nature. Making sure that people, everybody wants plug and play and simple, right? We can design our own disasters if we're not careful, because what we make so easy for the operator also makes it very easy for the attacker if they get into the path to exploit it. So, that's kind of my typical day. A lot of education, monitoring stuff, looking at logs, talking with my peers in the government and in the other utilities. It's not that sexy warrior thing. A lot of it is redundant education, and you keep looking, and the more people think they know, the more you remind them that they probably don't know as much about the problem as they think, so that they don't overlook the obvious. If you look at most attacks, when you go back and do the analysis, everybody has the V8 moment. You try to bring those to the surface before you get exploited on them. And that's how you stay safer. You're never safe, you're just safer.
Tim, I think you and I need an adult beverage here at some point, because I think we've got a lot of things to swap. You actually talking about the paper that you referenced, and actually winding back further in the point that you made to you know, vendors are going to make whatever we ask them to make, and make it in spades, cheaper, faster, more functional. Something that I referenced in my earlier presentation today. How many of you here have heard of the Girl Tech I Am Me? This is a pink pager that is essentially two-way pager with a full keyboard that is marketed to preteen girls for text messaging. And I mean, you can look at the architecture and pretty easily trace back how this thing evolved, you know, from just a brute stupid pager to two-way pager with a keyboard, and oh, well, now let's roll it forward a few years and call it text messaging instead of paging, and we'll paint it pink and sell it to a different market. Well, a gentleman that's a really good friend of mine by the name of Travis Goodspeed found this thing, and for the incredibly steep capital expenditure of $13, picked one up and found that the handy-dandy debug ports were still installed and wide open. He hooked up his little GoodFet circuit board, which is about the size of my index finger, to the back of this thing, and was able to reprogram it using Python scripting language. And now this little pink $13 toy is not only a full-featured 900 megahertz spectrum analyzer, but it has a transceiver in it, so it can send as well as receive. And I have seen on the display of these devices Zigbee network keys, you know, all kinds of.
But it's still a pager, though, right? You can still page back and forth.
You can
so
still
the girl
page,
doesn't
sure,
even know, right?
Sure. So there is
the point of putting technology out there that's so freaking complex that you can put all this other stuff on top of it. It does exactly what you think. There
is maybe a touch of additional functionality that crept into this device over the course of its evolution. So in the form of quid pro quo for the paper that you mentioned, I would pass on to you one from Travis called "Real Men Carry Pink Pagers."
That's an excellent story.
Okay.
Yes.
You have 60 seconds.
60 seconds. Click. Couple of things. One is that the paradigm shift that I was talking about in smart grid is also giving physical access of intelligent devices to people, and a portion of those people are going to be hackers. So the traditional models of, you know, putting confidentiality on it, you know, very sophisticated encryption schemes, having authentication and all of that is good. It helps you protect the credentials, for instance, when you're transmitting them. But that physical access, whether it's a smart meter or whether it may be a solar farm or a wind farm tomorrow, or any device, it could be an electric vehicle, we have to start thinking about how do we protect ourselves in that situation. So it comes back to the theme of this session, which is not just cybersecurity, but risk management. So in that risk management, the point I want to emphasize is the need for situational awareness after the breach has occurred in order to identify who the person is, what they're up to, and limit their sphere of influence in the infrastructure.
Right. So I guess by way of closing up and summarizing here, I think one of the first things you said there at the beginning of the session is this is like eating our peas, right? I mean, we come in here to talk about cybersecurity and think we're going to talk about firewalls and hacks and cross-scripting and all this stuff. And instead, we talked a lot about process, about compliance, about educating employees, and you know, and pink pagers, yeah, thank you, and innocent flesh on the bone. But the point of all that is this is hard stuff, and it's not all fun. But you can have the best technology in the world, and if you don't have the people right, it doesn't matter what you've done. If you don't have the processes right, it doesn't matter what you've done. And I hope that even though it's late in the day and you heard a whole lot about theoretically boring stuff, it resonates a little bit with you that a lot of the challenge here is just for us to go be the practitioners we are and make all this stuff work, not just keep looking for the next technical innovation. So I think with that, I'm going to say we're 1 minute over time, and you guys have been incredible. I had no work to do here except just say get going, and you all got going. So thanks very much. So I'd like you all to give them a round of applause.
For those of you who are on the webcast, if you have questions and you have posted them, I will document those and then send them to the panelists. Thank you.
So if you go to Travis, you also okay.